You are listening to MCC Votes and Seats, the podcast series of the Center for Political Science of Mathias Corvinus Collegium. We provide election insights with experts and politicians.
This time, we are going to talk about the early general elections that were held in the Netherlands on the 22nd of November 2023. We have the privilege to host Mr. Dave van Ginhoven, Senior Lecturer in the European Studies Program at the Hague University of Applied Sciences. Hey, Dave, thank you very much for accepting our invitation.
Well, thanks for having me.
So as to start, the 150 members of the Netherlands House of Representatives were up for election. According to the first findings, defying all expectations, Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, PVV, gained 37 seats, far more than the Labour-Green Alliance's 25 mandates and the Conservative Prime Minister Mark Rutte's People's Party for Freedom and Democracy's 24 seats. Dave, could you please elaborate a bit on what preliminary factors made it necessary to hold an early general election in the Netherlands?
Sure. It's not unusual to have an early election in the Netherlands. We joke about how often we've done it lately. Our outgoing Prime Minister, Mark Rutte, has been elected several times. He's the longest sitting Prime Minister in Europe. I think he only had one government that actually went the full term. It's quite normal that if there's a big scandal or there's political deadlock, that the government collapses and then we have an election again. The election from 2021, that was made necessary because of a scandal. It came out. The very short version of it is that there was racial profiling going on at the tax office, and people were accused of fraud and unfairly punished. And because this is ultimately the Prime Minister's responsibility, Rutte stepped down. We had another election, but he was reelected again, and his party was reelected again. And that's for a long time kind of been the joke, that every time we have a snap election, the same people who step down, presumably in disgrace, end up getting reelected. This time around, it was quite different because the government fell apart in the summer because of a migration issue, although it's a really tricky issue in that one could question whether or not the issue actually exists. But the government could not agree on immigration policies, so they decided to split up and then have a new election. And then between then and now, most of the established party leaders, members of parliament, including Prime Minister Mark Rutte himself, all indicated that they would be leaving politics. So that kind of made this election very interesting in that we were very used to having a new election and more or less getting the same result and seeing the same faces, sometimes in slightly different configurations. But this time around, we knew that it was at least going to be new faces. And that really opened the game up a little bit.
Having early elections in the Netherlands seems like a national tradition, but the results of this election was quite surprising. The number of votes the Freedom Party received was more than double compared to the votes it secured in the previous election. And the Labour-Green Alliance, led by former Vice President of the European Commission, Frans Timmermans, predicted to finish in second place with 25 seats, which is a significant increase from its existing 17 seats, parliamentary seats. As leader of the center-right VVD and the successor to outgoing Premier Mark Rutte, Dylan Yeşilköz has suffered several setbacks. So months should pass until coalition talks conclude. It's a quite difficult situation now. Which political formations made it to get in the legislative body this time?
Well, there are quite a few, because we have several sort of marginal parties, but there are a handful that really sort of matter. Of course, Geert Wilders' Freedom Party, the PVV, was the biggest, I believe, followed by the Green Left and Labour Party combination, followed by the VVD. Then you have a brand new party called New Social Contract, and New Social Contract was started by a man named Pieter Omtzigt, who was a member of parliament for the Christian Democrats, and split with his party over a rather complicated situation, partly involving his frustration with the government and also with the way that he was being treated within the party. And he also did quite well. He secured 20 seats, which is a lot for a brand new party. There's also the Farmer Citizen Movement, or the Boerenburgerbeweging. They're a new party that started up a couple of years ago, basically to protest government plans to limit nitrogen emissions in the Netherlands, which would require downsizing of some farms and the buying out of some farmers. And they're a party that did really well in our most recent provincial elections, but they didn't do nearly as well as expected in the general election. Underneath them, There are, D66, the Democratic Party. They're also sort of a centrist party. Some would argue center left, some would argue center right. They were in the last coalition, but they got hammered in this. They lost quite a few seats. I believe they're down to 9. And then you also have your traditional socialist party, been with us for a long time, but they didn't do particularly well. And then, below that line, there are several considerably smaller parties that have, 3 seats apiece. And there are a few parties who disappeared, smaller parties that didn't get enough votes to stay in parliament.
As far as I understand, in the Netherlands, if a party manages to get 1 mandate, it will get in the parliament. So it's a quite interesting system. I'm wondering how it works out. I mean, how can such parliamentary work, legislative work function with so many parties, with so many ideologies, with so many messages communicated to the voters?
That's a good question. The short answer is it works very, very slowly. We're going to have a negotiation period now between the parties to see what kind of coalitions can be formed. There has to be a coalition that represents the majority. Nobody knows how long it's going to take. The last one was our longest in history. It became kind of a running joke how long it was taking. The idea of Dutch democracy is that multiple parties have to gather and they have to compromise so that they can come to a government agreement, what they call a regeerakkoord, that represents the largest number of Dutch people. That has a lot of downsides, like it takes forever. It means that, things get watered down a lot, whereas, say, in the United States, where one party kind of wins and just gets to run things seem a bit more efficient. But on the flip side, more voices are represented and heard in all the processes and policies, and the system kind of protects the Dutch from extreme shifts of policy. And that's an important thing to note because there's a lot of talk, and I know in the media outside the Netherlands, there's a lot of talk of this being a sort of a Trump-like moment, or talk about Wilders as a quite far-right candidate and the country shifting to the far right. That's a valid discussion to be had and a valid observation. But at the same time, what a lot of the outside media doesn't keep in mind is that in order to govern, if he is to govern, Mr. Wilders and his Freedom Party have to negotiate with at least 2 other parties and possibly more. And that means that his more extreme rhetoric and his more extreme ideas are going, by definition, to be watered down tremendously. He's already done a press conference where he spoke about how he's going to be the prime minister for all Dutch people, and that includes the Muslims he spent the last 20 years railing against. He's in a position now where he can't be an opposition guy who can say whatever he wants, no matter how provocative it is. He can't really continue to shout for, the banning of Korans or the closing of mosques because A, he has to make deals with other parties, and B, the Dutch Constitution is pretty clear on things like freedom of religion. So he has to, put aside campaign rhetoric and get into the world of what he can realistically really do. And he has to deal with all these other parties. And that's no small feat. The 2 of the other parties have said they are open to talking with him. But being open to talking with him is not the same thing as making a deal about how to govern the country. If a deal is to be made, it's going to have to be closer to the middle. It may be further to the right than what we're used to in the Netherlands, but it's not going to be as far to the right as Wilders' campaign rhetoric would suggest.
Talking about Wilders, right after the election, he said, the voters have spoken and they have said that they are fed up. We are going to make sure that Dutch voters will be put first again. If Wilders were elected prime minister of the Netherlands, he would prioritize reducing immigration. But in order to build up a coalition government, he will have to make concessions, since other parties would reject his most radical ideas, especially any plans to ban the Quran or pull the nation out of the EU, as you briefly addressed. But the historic election victory of his party will impact the Netherlands and other countries in Europe as well. I'm sure about that. But right now, the question is whether any other parties would be open to forming an alliance with Wilders, because he's not going to find an outright majority in parliament, even though his party has emerged as the largest. What were his main messages in the campaign? What were the main messages of other big parties
It's been a campaign that for a long time was rather boring, to be honest. It got a little exciting towards the end because there were some surprises. It seemed clear before election day that Wilders might take the largest number of votes, but the extent of his victory was surprising. The main issues really plaguing the country kind of help explain it, though, that the cabinet collapsed over a supposed migration crisis. I don't mean to be polemic or biased here, but I would suggest that there isn't really a migration crisis in the Netherlands, that what happened was much more nuanced. When they talk about migration, they were talking specifically about refugees and asylum seekers. And there's also been a lot of rhetoric about international students. But at the end of the day, migration in the Netherlands, net migration is not really that out of whack. There aren't that many more people coming into the country than leaving or, going away by natural causes. And the number of asylum seekers coming to the Netherlands in 2023 turned out to be quite a bit lower than what was expected. It was expected that there were going to be, something like 70,000 was a number that was thrown around at one point, and the real number was much, much, much lower. But there's a perception in the Netherlands that migration's out of control, and that in particular that there are too many asylum seekers. A lot of this has to do with the fact that our neoliberal government has refused to raise budgets for the asylum seeker centers and processing. There's only one major processing center for asylum seekers in the country. It's in a place called Ter Apel in the north of the country in Groningen. And it's understaffed, under-budgeted, and under-resourced, and doesn't have enough beds. And this created situations where 2 summers ago, people were sleeping outside in really, really terrible conditions. I believe a baby died in that center. This, of course, created a situation where in the news, you're seeing an over-flooded refugee center, and you're hearing stories about the local community dealing with more refugees than they're comfortable with. That gives people the sense that, this is out of control, or there's way too many people, we can't handle this. But really, it was more of a question of not properly preparing and not properly resourcing the center involved or opening more centers. There was a lot of talk about where are we going to put these people? Should they be redistributed? There was maybe going to be a law to suggest that there should maybe be a law that every community would be required to take asylum seekers and so on and so forth. This all transpired at the same time as a lot of general discontent. People are pissed off. We got through 2 years of COVID, and that really upset a lot of people, and there was a lot of drama in the Netherlands. But we also have dealt with a lot of inflation, incredibly high energy prices, a lot of economic insecurity, a lot of people feeling like they're falling behind or they can't keep up, can't pay their bills. And then we also have this enormous housing crisis. By crisis, I just mean a dramatic shortage of housing. There are not enough houses, not enough apartments in the Netherlands, and there are too many people who want to live in them. All of this frustration is built up for quite a while. Simultaneously, you have this populist farmers movement, which is suggesting that the Dutch government and the EU and the World Economic Forum are trying to take things over, take the farmers' land. Some people present that as kind of communism. And I think all of that sort of coalesced into a lot of frustration among voters. Nobody really gives voice to frustration quite like a populist like Wilders. Wilders is quite good at channeling that and sort of suggesting that all these problems can be solved in a simple way, that the healthcare system can be improved and that we can build more houses, that we can simply ignore the European Union's nitrogen emissions rules and allow more construction or leave the farmers alone. And that was very appealing to a lot of people. And I think the secret of his success was that he had a very broad tent in his messaging, in that he was going to go after a lot of different issues. He was able to siphon a lot of voters off of some of the other parties that were also parties of protest, like the farmer movement. The farmer movement was essentially a protest party, but Wilders sort of managed to seize the general zeitgeist of voter frustration. And I think the research shows something like 35% of the farmer party voters drifted over to Wilders. He also took a few votes probably from the other far-right party, the Forum for Democracy, which was expecting to get 5 to 8 seats, but ended up with 3, and a few other parties. Wilders kind of championed that, the idea that the government and the European Union and these higher forces are taking things away from the average Dutch person, and he was going to fight for the average Dutch person. That turned out to be even more successful than anyone realized, I think, because he kind of surprised everybody right before the election by sort of for the first time showing a real interest in governing. I've followed Wilders for over 20 years, and he's always been a prominent figure in Dutch politics. He's always run and he's always been popular, but he's never really demonstrated a serious ambition to govern. He's always been quite comfortable in the opposition. The socialists in the Netherlands are also quite comfortable in the opposition. Opposition's a great place to be because you never have to worry about being wrong in that sense, right? When you govern, you have to worry about getting caught in a mistake. But when you're in the opposition, all you have to do is throw rocks. And this time around, he suddenly said he really wanted to govern, and he suggested that he was open to compromise on just about anything. And I think that gave voters the sense that he had a real chance of actually governing, that they could really get something different from the established order. And I think that inspires some people to vote for him.
Now it seems Wilders' time has come, but now that you mentioned the EU, with the European Parliament elections scheduled for June next year, which are expected to be contested on the same topics, basically, as the Dutch election, immigration, the cost of living, climate change, stuff like that. Wilders' victory serves as a signal to mainstream parties around Europe. He is a hardline Eurosceptic. He has called for a so-called Nexit referendum earlier on.
Well, I think most parties in the Netherlands are not interested in an exit. They're not interested in leaving the EU. While some are somewhat critical of the EU, most of them, I think, want to stay in the EU. The general position in the Netherlands is that, the EU has kept us all safe and wealthy, and it's kept Europeans from trying to kill each other for 8 decades. So anti-EU sentiment, I don't think, is as widespread, because people came to Wilders for different reasons. He's a big tent guy. Not all the people who voted for him are necessarily anti-EU. But I think that what Wilders and Orban have in common is that I think they like having the EU as a punching bag and as a boogeyman. It's very convenient because a lot of people in Europe today feel a bit left behind and disenfranchised, partly because globalization and capitalism have taken, a lot of jobs, like, say, manufacturing jobs, and moved them out. And a lot of people got left behind. And if you're angry about that, it's difficult to be angry at capitalism or globalization because those are abstract ideas that you can't punch in the nose. But if somebody can point to Brussels or the World Economic Forum or to migrants and say, this is why, you can't find an apartment because there's too many migrants, or you can't get a job because the World Economic Forum or the EU don't want to allow us to emit nitrogen and they're restricting industry, or it's a very sort of a convenient straw man in a way for everything. I don't know with Wilders how deep his EU sentiment goes, but I also think it doesn't really matter that much because he has to do business with at least 2 other parties. And it's highly unlikely that he'll find 2 other parties that want to get out of the European Union who want to actually make that a policy initiative. I think most Dutch parties are pro-EU, definitely pro-NATO. And there are a few, like, for example, I earlier mentioned our other far-right party, the Forum for Democracy, tend to be against the Netherlands' effort to assist with Ukraine. Wilders has also been critical of it, but I think his position on it is a little bit more nuanced than those far-right parties. I don't think anybody wants to pull the Netherlands out of the EU or out of NATO anytime soon.
Based on the voting rates, can any geographical or social characteristics be established regarding the party preferences of the electorate in the Netherlands? Because, we are talking about the nation of the polder model, the method of economic and social consensus decision-making that in the 80s and the 90s has been described as a pragmatic recognition of cooperation despite differences. So are there any urban or rural or north and south or east and west fault lines, any social divides in the Netherlands in terms of the party preferences?
There are social divides, but they're not as geographic at the moment as they used to be. Things used to be a little bit more like what you're describing. Like, there was a time, say, when, like, Rotterdam is a working class city historically because of its harbor. And so it used to be a stronghold for labor. But as you see in a lot of other countries, a lot of labor parties and progressive parties are no longer the preferred parties of the working class in a lot of countries, partly because of the rise of populism. That started already back in the early 2000s in Rotterdam with a party called Livable Rotterdam, or Leefbaar Rotterdam, which spawned a national party called the Lijst Pim Fortuyn, Pim Fortuyn's list. Pim Fortuyn was a populist who ran for office in 2002, but he was murdered. He was assassinated. And his legacy sort of still lives on in a lot of the populism and right-wing movements in the Netherlands. And in this election, what we saw was that, Amsterdam remained a left-wing bubble, sort of true to form or true to cliche or true to stereotyping. But beyond that, most of the country went for Wilders. There's the region around Twente in the east predominantly went for Omtzigt, for the new social contract. And I think that's just because Pieter Omtzigt is from that region. The rest of the country, quite a lot of people went to Wilders. Traditionally, areas where there's more farming tend to be strongholds for the Christian Democrats, but that wasn't the case this time around. The Farmer Party also didn't do as well as it usually does as usually. It's only been around for a couple of years, but it didn't do as well as expected in areas where there's a lot of farming. Even we have a so-called Bible Belt in the Netherlands of kind of religiously conservative communities, and they often vote for the Christian parties, in particular, one called the Christian Reform Party. It's a small party, 2 to 3 seats in most elections. Even those communities all sort of went for the PVV. Here in The Hague as well, the PVV was also the majority. This is kind of showing that there is a social divide to some extent in terms of social class, although please don't make the mistake of thinking I'm saying that working class people all vote populist and that higher class people vote, more progressive, because that's also not really true. There are educated voters and high income voters for these right-wing parties as well. But I think it's because they harness this frustration, and the frustration goes beyond what town I'm from or my local community, and it's more of this general feeling of like, why is gas so expensive? That kind of cuts through a lot of the other divides.
To conclude our most thought-provoking conversation, let me ask personally, what did you find the most interesting or outstanding about this ballot?
The extent of Wilders' success was surprising. I was surprised by his seemingly sudden willingness to compromise, because I always assumed personally that he never intended to govern. It seems like he really does want a seat at the table this time. So that I found quite surprising. Occasionally, the tone of the election was a bit surprising, or at least non-traditional. Dutch politics have, especially since the times of Corona, the tone has gotten a lot harder, a lot more hostile. The public is more hostile towards politicians. We used to brag that our prime minister rides his bike to work every day. But during Corona, we saw a lot of politicians getting harassed out in the street, by people who had strong opinions about COVID or about lockdown measures or whatever. Some of that QAnon nonsense where people believe that the government's run by satanic pedophiles also spilled over into the Netherlands. And some of those confrontations were kind of ugly. During one of the debates, Wilders made a fat joke about Frans Timmermans, his opposing candidate, that a lot of people took offense at, but it went a little bit beyond what you normally saw in a debate. The tone of it was a bit harsher than usual. And there were 2 assaults against Thierry Baudet, the leader of the Dutch Forum for Democracy, the far-right party that I mentioned. He was assaulted at a visit in Belgium a few weeks ago, I believe by a Ukrainian who was offended by or a supporter of Ukraine at least, who was offended by Baudet's seeming support of Russia. But also, right before the election, at an event at a bar where Baudet was posing for photos, someone hit him on the head with a beer bottle. And that kind of thing is unusual in the Netherlands, That we've seen it more in recent years, but normally we're a use your words culture, where everything is a discussion. And we've seen this sort of increase in threats and intimidation and actual violence. One of the members of our outgoing government, Sigrid Kaag, she was Minister of Finance, she decided to leave politics in part because of all the death threats she was getting. A guy showed up at her house with a torch, wanting to talk to her one day. She was on a television program where she was being interviewed, but the interviewer confronted her with videos. They interviewed her daughters, and her daughters were talking about how scared they were about the death threats that she was getting. And I think this partly contributed to her decision to leave politics. That is unusual for us in the Netherlands. And it's more than a little disturbing, to be honest, to see that level of hostility. I mean, I've watched parliamentary coverage for years in this country, and I've seen how people who disagree with Wilders dramatically can still slap him on the back and make jokes with him in other contexts, but there seems to be, lines crossed in that. I found that very interesting, very surprising, very worrying. I also think that the most interesting part is really to come, because you see a lot of coverage, the Netherlands moves to the right or whatever, but the Netherlands hasn't moved anywhere yet. The proof of the pudding is in the eating, and in Dutch politics, the proof of the election result is in the coalition. And we don't really know what's going to happen yet. It seems like there are only a couple of clear possibilities, but it's going to be weeks, maybe months, maybe more before we know what's going to really become of this. You have different scenarios. Scenario one is Wilders makes a deal and gets a coalition. That's a big if still. You mentioned Mark Rutte's party, the People's Party for Freedom and Democracy, the VVD. They are an interesting X factor here because the VVD is probably essential to any coalition, which means they have an incredible amount of negotiating power. Wilders probably cannot form a coalition without them. He probably also can't form a coalition without the new social contract. He needs one or both of those parties. And that means we're going to see a very lengthy period of discussion. We really have to wait and see what comes out of that. But even if Wilders succeeds in making a coalition, personally, I have my doubts about how long that coalition will last. Wilders has never governed. He's willing to. He has a political party that is not very well organized. It's not really a political party. It has no members. It has no governing board. It's just Wilders and more or less a fan club. It doesn't have a lot of experienced politicians in it or people with administrative backgrounds. And apart from a few people at the top of his list, there aren't very many people in that party who are ready to take responsibility for the Ministry of Finance or the Ministry of Justice or the Ministry of Education. Throughout our history in the Netherlands, we've seen that when inexperienced parties or parties that don't have a lot of experienced members suddenly achieve great success, things often fall apart quickly. We saw this with, I mentioned Pim Fortuyn. His party did very well after his assassination in the early 2000s, and they got into government. But they were a new party. They were an inexperienced party of populists, and the whole thing crumbled in a matter of months. I suspect that if Wilders is able to form a coalition, there's a very serious risk that that coalition will fall apart, either because of the lack of political experience and acumen in its membership, or because conflicts with other parties are inevitable. Wilders was technically like a silent partner in a previous government to help Rutte secure a majority, and he torpedoed that as well, ultimately. If he forms a government, I don't think it's likely to last 4 years. The other possibility is that he's unable to form a government. And if he's unable, then the process is such that they'll look at what other coalitions are possible. And you could still see the return of Frans Timmermans. You could see his Green Left Labor combination together with, again, the VVD and probably the new social contract and possibly also D66, the Democratic Party. You could see them forming a coalition that would probably be fairly stable, middle of the road, and would probably run for the full 4 years. I don't know which scenario it will be. It'll be interesting to watch. I think that in terms of social cohesion, it would probably be better and maybe even more fair for Wilders to have a shot. If I take my own political opinion out of it, a lot of people voted for him. And if he doesn't get to govern, those people will spend the next couple of years feeling unheard, ignored. And this will further the divides that propelled his success in the first place, because people voted for him because they don't feel heard or seen or represented. And they feel like the government doesn't represent me. They don't care about me. If we have an election and he's the overwhelming winner and he doesn't end up in charge, those people will feel even more justified in their anger. So I think for the long term, while I don't personally think that Wilders would make a good prime minister, it's the most diplomatic way I can phrase it, based on my understanding of politics, it would be in the long term a better situation in terms of governance and in terms of the things that I think are important to have a government led by someone like Timmermans. Also not personally a huge fan of Timmermans, to be honest, but I think that would probably be a better government. I think that letting Wilders go have his government first might be the better choice, though, because even if you get a better government with a different coalition, all of those Wilders supporters will feel cheated. And I think you won't see any healing of those divides. Whereas if he really does have a fair chance and he's given a chance to govern, I think really interesting things will happen. Because again, as I said, I find it difficult to believe that he'll form a government that will last. But on top of that, and this is something I've spoken to a lot of young people who are very concerned and they don't like Wilders and they're afraid. And, some of their fears are justified, even though, like, the man has said, yeah, I'm going to be prime minister of all Dutch people and things will be different than in the campaign. This man has spent 2 decades talking about how Muslims don't belong in this country. There's over 1 million people that have been told repeatedly for 2 decades, you don't belong here. You're not welcome here. You should go away. He's not just referring to all Dutch citizens. Historically, he's referring to ethnically Dutch people. He can try to sweep that under the rug now, but this has been what he's been about since the early 2000s. But on top of that, I also think that they will be forced to compromise on so many things. They can't continue talking about banning the Quran and closing mosques or whatever. Any voter who chose him because they expected that outcome is going to be incredibly disillusioned in the end and very disappointed. I don't want to stereotype his voters as uninformed, but I don't think that very many of his voters actually read his program. I don't think that they really realize how many of his program points are impossible or unconstitutional. And I think there's this feeling now like, now it's our turn. We get our say, but it's not really going to play out like that. And so it might be best for everyone if he is given his chance to try to govern and forced to compromise, water everything down to the point where the xenophobic part of his base is truly disappointed and goes elsewhere, and let it continue until a possible collapse. And hey, on the other hand, if I'm wrong, if he forms a government and is successful and he manages to truly water down that rhetoric about Muslims, for example, or migrants or foreigners in general, then maybe that could be interesting to watch too. Anything is possible.
Dutch elections are getting more and more exciting with a lot of drama, action, illusions, and comedy going on. The big question is how and when the parties would be open to forming an alliance, to form a government, and on what conditions. Dear listeners, You've been following the latest episode of the Votes and Seats podcast series on the Dutch early general elections with Dave van Ginhoven from the Hague University. Dear Dave, we are rather grateful for your most precious time and thoughts about the early ballot in the Netherlands.
Well, thank you for having me. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope your listeners get something out of it. And I hope that wherever they are and whatever they do, that they vote in their own elections. Elections are interesting. They do matter. We saw a lot of people stay home in this one because they feel like, oh, we keep doing this again and again and nothing changes. Well, look, something changed. Participate. It's a cliche, but it's true. If you don't vote, you don't have a right to complain about what happens next. And it looks like a lot of Dutch people are going to be complaining in the next few years, but at least they earn that right by going out and doing their democratic duty to make sure that you do the same, whatever your politics are.
I totally agree with you, Dave. Thank you very much.